All right, we're going to take a look at finance. And the very beginning of this is kind of working through just some ideas about money and percents. And so we're going to look at things like total amount paid, total interest paid. So let's take a look. Again, you should be trying this whole thing first before you watch this video. So try and make sense of it, especially the first several exercises. See if you're able to do those. All right, so now to kind of double check, it says Kenra makes $20 an hour at her part-time job. She works 15 hours per week. So how much money will she make in 4 weeks? So if she's doing $20 an hour for 15 hours in a week, we're going to say 20 times 15, and that's going to be $300. Now she's doing that for 4 weeks, so we're going to take that $300 and we can multiply it by 4, which means that after 4 weeks, she'll have $1,200. Next, we have Rosa. She gets $15 a week for her allowance. And the question is kind of the opposite this time. Instead of finding out how much money she'll have in the end, we want her to have $300. So we want to know how long that it's going to take her to earn that $300. So we know that the outcome we want is $300, and the way we're going to get that is by doing $15 for every week, so $15 per week. So like if she worked 2 weeks, it would be 15 times 2, but that would only be 30. So we need 15 times some amount, and that's going to be 300. So we can set that up as an equation and solve. Some of you guys might just think about it. If you notice, there's a little relationship with some numbers going on here, that 20 times 15 makes 300. So that could tell us that W is equal to 20. So we could say that it's going to take 20 weeks. However you want to think about that. We could also, again, solve by dividing both sides of this little equation we set up by 15. 300 divided by 15 gets us 20. So again, we know that it will happen in 20 weeks. She'll have $300. Now, Pedro gets $1,200 a month, or not gets, he pays for rent. So after 10 years, how much money has he paid? So let's think about this. Months and years. There are 12 months in 1 year. So we could take that 1,200 times 12, but we're not just doing it for 1 year, we're doing it for 10 years. So we're going to say times 10. So that's going to get us 1,200 times 12. 12 times 12 is 144. And those are hundreds, 1,200. So we're going to have 144 hundreds, or 14,400, multiplied by that by 10. And we're going to have $144,000 that he has paid in rent in 10 years. Now, let's suppose that you have $2,500 a month that you're paying for your house. And this is monthly. After 30 years, we need to think about how much we have actually paid. So we know that $2,500 a month, so let's just think about in 1 year. That's going to be 2,500 times 12, because there's 12 months in 1 year. That gets us $30,000, punching that into a calculator. And then we're going to take that $30,000, that's yearly, times the 30 years that it's talking about. And that's going to be a total of $900,000. A lot of money going on. So then we start to consider like what's better, renting or buying. And it really depends on your particular situation and what you have going on. So let's think about when we buy a house. There's going to be something called interest, which we'll see soon how to calculate it. But let's imagine that you did buy a house and it was a $600,000 home. Your monthly payments for 30 years totaled over $1 million there, $1,100,000. And so then it's saying, how much interest did you pay? Well, the total interest paid is going to be equal to the difference between how much the house actually cost and what you paid. So you paid $1,100,000. The actual house cost $600,000. That means all that additional money that you paid, which is $500,000, would be the interest. So it's always the interest plus the house amount to total what you paid. So we can do the subtraction to find that total interest. Now, Keisha makes monthly payments of $550 for 6 years for a car. So switching from home buying to car buying. how much will you have paid after 6 years? So $550, these are monthly payments, so $550 times 12, we're going to do this for 6 years. We're going to have $6,600 times 6, which will be equal to $39,600. Just so you know, I'm not doing this off the top of my head. I used a calculator, so you can use a calculator too to figure this out. So this is how much that they actually paid. Now again, the car only cost $35,000. Why did I pay $39,600? That's because of interest. So I'm going to take that amount I paid minus the actual cost. Go back and change that to actual house cost. This is the actual car cost. This is how much you paid. So if we subtract that, that's going to again tell me how much interest I paid, which would be $4,600. And now as we're talking about this interest, normally it is some sort of percentage of what your purchase is. So let's think about some percents. Percent really means per 100. Coming from that word cent, like a century, which is 100 years. And so if we have 100%, if you see that, that means you have 100 out of 100. And so, kind of skipping over, 1 whole would be that. Half as a percent would be 50%. And again, that's because you're really looking at 50 out of 100, amount per 100. That's what we're saying when we say 50%. So 100% of 800,000, that's going to be really just that whole 800,000. You're taking 100% of it. That means the whole chunk. Now, if we look at 50%, that's going to be half of 800,000. So if we want to do half of 800,000, that's going to be 400,000. And you can do that a couple of ways. You can actually enter 1/2 times 800,000. That's kind of what I was thinking in my head. You could also enter 50% as 0.50 times 800,000 on a calculator. Both of those work. 25%, that would be 0.25 times 800,000. But if we already know 50%, just a thing to notice, then 25% is half of that. So half of 400,000 would be 200,000. You could double check that with your calculator, but it's kind of nice to do some mental math sometimes. And then when we look at 75%, really that is the 50% and the 25%. So 400,000 plus 200,000, it's going to be $600,000. Again, with a calculator though, you could say 0.75 or 0.75 times 800,000. That's the chunk we're talking about. So the 75% of 800, it's a pretty big chunk. Now 10% of 800,000, some of you guys are able to do that also in your head. 10% is really just moving our decimal place over, which would get us 80,000. Like you're dividing out by 10, because again, 10% is 10 out of 100, which is 1/10. So we're taking 1/10 of that 800,000, which is equivalent to $80,000. With a calculator, you could put 0.10 times 800,000 and get that same result. Now at 1%, that's 1 out of 100, so that's going to be quite small. So 1/100th of 800,000, that's like dividing that by 100, which leaves us with, taking over basically 2 zeros, 8,000. So $8,000. On a calculator, you could put 0.01 times 800,000, and you could get 8,000. All right, continuing on, exercise 4, we want to buy a house that costs $900,000, and we'd like to make a 20% down payment to avoid extra fees. So if you bought a house before, sometimes there is some additional fees if you don't put down that whole 20% It's called PMI, private mortgage insurance. It just kind of covers you if your house goes down in value because you haven't put down enough money to cover it. So 20% of 900,000. So we really want to know, what is 20%? So there's, again, a couple different ways. I like mental math. So I think about 10% would be 90,000. And 20% is twice that. So we're going to do 2 times that 90,000, which is $180,000. That's a big amount of money, but then that would cover the down payment for that home that is close to $1 million. If you enter on your calculator, you'll get the same amount, 0.20 times 900,000, and you should get $180,000. So how much will our loan actually be for? Well, the home was originally costing $900,000, but if we pay $180,000, we're going to take that off of that total house amount, which would leave our loan amount at $720,000 instead. Now it asks, what's 80% of that house cost? So the house was $900,000. So if we want to do 80%, again, you could use your calculator, 0.80 times that 900,000. We're going to end up with $720,000. And so we notice that these are the same numbers. Well, why is that? What did we do? Well, remember, 900,000 was 100% of the home price. 180,000 was 20% of the home price. And so that would mean that this would be the leftover chunk, which is 80%. So another way to think about how much you have to pay, similar like at a store, if you're getting something on discount and say something says that it's 25% off, you can imagine that you're actually going to pay 75%. So I do that like at the end of Halloween, Christmas, and you'll see things like 90% off. Well, you're only going to pay how much? 10%. So we know that our total will have to add up to that 100. So that's something that we can do. So let's see, a house costs $650,000. You want to make a 10% down payment this time. How much do we need to save? So we're looking at 10% of that $650,000. That's going to be equal to $65,000. Remember, it's just dividing by 10 because 10% is really 10 out of 100, which is 1/10. You could also enter 0.10 times 650,000 onto your calculator. So how much will our loan be for? Again, we can kind of think about it like up above and say, well, 10% down, that means we're going to pay 90% of that $650,000 for our loan. So if you do that, again, 0.90 times 650,000 will be $585,000. Or we could just take our total home price, which was that 650,000, take off our down payment, which was 65,000, and we end up, you can see, with that same amount. Either way, that's what our loan will be for. Now, a standard loan is generally for 30 years. So how much we need to pay each month? And just a little side note, this is not including interest. This is just paying what we would call the principal loan amount. So if we know that we need to pay $585,000 for 30 years, let's think about how many payments that would be. So 30 years, each year has 12 months in it. That's 360 payments. So if we take that $585,000 and divide it by 360, that would get me how much each of my payments, really the minimum just principal, would need to be. So that's $1,625. Now, if I make $4,000 a month and I want my monthly payment to be no more than 30%, that's kind of a standard that you don't want your housing to be more than 30% of what you get paid. So let's think about what 30% of that 4,000 is. So we could do 0.30 times 4,000, or think about it lots of different ways, but that's going to get me $1,200. So what that means is that I want my housing to be no more than $1,200. And so already, without even thinking about that interest that I'm going to normally have to pay, I'm over that amount. So I would not be able to afford that. It's, let's see how much, $425, too much. And so you can see on the bottom, it's starting to talk about that interest, that banks are taking a little bit of a risk by loaning you money. So as an incentive for them to make money and for you to pay it back, they charge you interest. And it's a percentage of whatever you borrow. So imagine a situation that you need a car loan and your mom's going to help you, okay? $28,000 is how much you need a loan for. And so your mom, family member, or somebody says they'll loan it to you, but they're going to charge you 5%. And that 5% is, we call it simple interest. But normally that's kind of what happens with a family loan. You just give you a percentage of that whole amount of money you would want to borrow. So what we want to figure out is what's 5% of that 28,000. And so if you enter 0.05 times 28,000, you're going to get $1,400. And so that is the interest. It says each year it's 5%. So that's the interest for 1 year. So if we want to pay off the debt in 2 years, we're going to have to do that amount, $1,400 times 2, which will be $2,800 in interest. And so the total that you have to pay in 2 years would be the original $28,000 plus the interest, $1,400 twice, which is really $2,800. And so together, that would be $30,800 is how much that you'd have to pay back. And so this was, again, the car plus the interest will equal your total paid. And so you can kind of see, it looks kind of crazy right here, but this is actually exactly what we did. P naught is the principal. So in our case, that was $28,000. Our interest rate was 5%. I wrote it as 0.05. And then T is our time, which we did this for 2 years. And so what you saw end up happening is we took 28,000 and we multiplied it by 0.05, but then we had to double it. And so that was our total interest we paid, which ended up being that $2,800. And so for the amount that we owe, we said, okay, well, let's take that amount and add it to the original principal amount, which is $28,000. And you can see we can write it a little bit differently because this interest, right, it was made up of 28,000 times 0.05 times 2. And we could kind of see that 28,000 written twice. So if we like undistribute that, we could end up rewriting as 28,000 times 1 plus 0.05 times 2, which looks a lot like this. Our principal, the number 1 standing for, that's the whole amount I owe. And then I also owe a little chunk of that. So that's that rate times time. And so interpreting the meaning of this, you could see it all right here. And that formula would give us exactly the amount because of what it's doing. That amount is equal to that P naught plus I, which was that 28,000 plus $2,800. Now, if we took longer to pay it back, it says 3 years and then 5 years. It wants to know about the interest. So let's use that formula exactly. It says P naught times RT. So our principal, that starting amount is 28,000. Our interest rate is 5%. So I'm taking 0.05. And we're talking about 3 years. So really it's just tripling that 1,400, which makes 4,200 in interest. And so if we take 5 years, we're just going to change that to a 5. So our interest is equal to 28,000 times 0.05 times those 5 years, and that's going to be now $7,000. So you can see that the longer we're taking to pay, the more interest that we're going to have to pay as well. So it's going to cost more in the long run if we take longer to pay it off. All right, when we get back, we'll talk about something called compounding interest.